Happy New Year, and a lot going on, huh?
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
You know, I never thought I'd see this, that a tweet, literally a tweet this morning from Donald Trump changed the course of some more than 100 votes in Congress. A tweet. We've been saying this is going to be, strap it on, put your helmet on type of 2017. And no doubt the news cycle will be chasing developments like it never has before due to social media and the president-elect and soon-to-be president's use of it. Good evening. Nice to have you aboard. Michael Kennedy is here today. He is the professor of International and Public Affairs at Brown University, one of the first Brown deep thinkers that I've had here on the broadcast, and I haven't had him for a while. He's very, very smart on things of Russia, Ukraine, and the like, and what's going on with this notion that Donald Trump knows something we don't know about Russian hacking. I thought he'd be a great guy to bring in. So we'll talk about that coming up in segment number 2 of the broadcast tonight. We're going to pass on a rundown. There's all sorts of things that I'd like to set up for 2017, but we'll kind of get through that over the course of the week. In the meantime, it was this story that kind of was buzzing out of Washington over the weekend, right? House Republicans have now pulled the plan to gut independent ethics panel after the Trump tweets. You know, the House panel that really has been the place of review, reform, not necessarily adjudication, was slipped under House ethics. Easy for me to think. House ethics over the weekend with a vote. And reportedly, the leadership didn't like it, but the leadership couldn't do anything about it until Donald Trump tweeted. Kev, he tweeted.
President-elect Donald Trump scolded the new Republican-led Congress via Twitter today. Do they really have to make the weakening of the independent ethics watchdog their #1 act and priority? Focus on tax reform, health care, and so many other things of far greater importance. Shortly after, House Speaker Paul Ryan responded with a statement on the closed-door vote by Republican members of the House last night. In it, he says, the Office of Congressional Ethics is in need of reform, but that it will continue to operate independently, but with oversight from a congressional committee chaired by a Republican whose job it is to make sure the office is properly following its rules and laws. Ryan spoke out against the vote last night, as did Democrats who warned the change effectively makes it harder for Congress to police members who are corrupt. All House members will vote on it today. Republicans also plan to make good on their promise to repeal the Affordable Care Act starting this afternoon. Senators will vote on a measure to shield the repeal from Democratic filibusters that could slow things down. Mr. Trump tweeted this morning, Obamacare just doesn't work. It's not affordable and it's lousy health care. Georgia Congressman Doug Collins agrees.
What we've seen so much with Obamacare is what's happened is that what sounded good turned out to be a disaster.
But Democrats say millions of Americans would lose their new insurance. President Obama heads to Capitol Hill tomorrow to see what he can do to save his signature achievement.
That's amazing. There are 2 stories in that package. I'm sure you've got lots to say about both of them. Good to see you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
We brought you in originally because we schedule in advance on this broadcast. People have to make appointments on the Russian thing, and we've got a lot to talk about there. But clearly, I'm sure you've got some things to say about this development. Are you as fascinated as I am about the way this whole thing is rolling out here?
I've been fascinated by American politics like I've never been before for the last year. It's completely unprecedented, unexpected, and all of the expertise that we thought we had has flown out the window. So we need to rethink not just what has happened in America, but what's happening in the world. Because we're, I think, entering a new stage in the history of the world, and we have to refine our lenses. We have to rethink our foundations to recognize what's going on.
I don't know what you mean by that. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know what you mean by that. Has one man changed the way your expertise has been developed all over the course of the years?
So if by one man you might mean our president-elect, he's not the only man who's changing the rules of the game. We can think about Brexit, too. Brexit was completely unexpected. We can
and
think about
perhaps not well thought out by the people who
Oh.
called for it. Many of whom are thinking,
That's right.
What did we just
That's
do?
right.
It's kind of like a political one-night stand in some ways.
So back in the fall of 2015, I think it was, I wrote a little essay for a European publication called something like Übermensch Escapism. Because the problems we're facing in this world are so complex, so difficult, and nobody seems to have good answers, so many of us are putting our faith in those who claim to have answers. And so when Brexit was supposed to solve everything, when Putin promises to solve everything, when Hungary's president promises to solve everything, people want to put their faith in something. And so those promises matter. And Trump is, continuing in that tradition.
This is a theme that's being echoed by a lot of smart political people, that we have a, I don't know, kind of an authoritarian, potential totalitarian kind of flavor that is just all around us. Of course, our democracy is built to withstand that kind of dynamic, but there's going to be, at least from the president-elect, a feeling like he can do things because he just wants to do things, and it will be very interesting to see if he can.
Right.
Today, let's talk about today. Today fueled his fire.
Yeah.
He was able to tweet what fellow House Republicans are doing. Put that up again if you can, Kev. He was able to tweet, that their priorities aren't straight. Not that I disagree with him, by the way, on this, but he was able to tweet this and change the course of what is, a backdoor vote over the weekend. Good thing, bad thing?
Oh, it's so good for him that he changed it. It's so good for the country that he changed it.
He made a good call.
He made a great call.
He did, there's no doubt.
And the House leadership was opposed to this call for abolishing that, putting that committee under the House.
Professor,
right?
I always have a kind of a house of cards disposition about this kind of stuff, that as it appears, may not be, that the House leadership kind of went the way of, I wish our rank and file hadn't done this. Oops, sorry. Right. I don't know. It's hard to believe anything coming out of there anymore in some ways. But if you go by the script, the leadership couldn't keep the rank and file Republicans down from really taking what was, in their minds, an oppressive ethics process off the table. Well, it's back on because he tweeted.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
It's fascinating.
So if he's right a whole bunch of times in his new way of doing business, we're going to be in great shape. If he's wrong a whole bunch of times...
Right. And we don't have bankruptcy law to get us out of trouble.
Meaning?
Right? Meaning that he has a practice of taking extreme stands, knowing that he can recover. How many bankruptcies has he had? 6 bankruptcies or something like that? So we have a system that protects people, enables people to start again. But when you're president of the United States, we can't have a bankruptcy policy of foreign affairs or domestic governance.
So, this one really, in essence, minor development today does or does not advise you on the bigger picture?
It advises me that I need to rethink the power of Twitter. And the ways in which...
Say that slowly again.
We need to rethink the power of Twitter. I tweet. And when I was in administrative positions, I didn't want to tweet because I knew I could make a mistake. Trump is making mistakes all the time. But he's not like Ronald Reagan as the Teflon president, right? He is somehow different, that he can absorb these mistakes and just say, hey, I didn't really say that, or, well, I changed my mind. And so there was a beautiful piece actually in the New Yorker recently in which they tried to identify what his ideology was. And they identified 3 things beyond race questions, which are, going to be complicated for anyone who's white. But the first thing they said, he's an economic nationalist. Secondly, that he is trying to introduce a style of governance without accountability. He's not even accountable to himself. What he says yesterday doesn't constrain him from saying something entirely different today.
Which is fine if he's wrong originally.
That's right. We should be big enough to make we should be big enough to change our mind and acknowledge our mistakes. He changes his mind without ever acknowledging that he made a mistake.
That's true, and actually ignoring or denying that what he said prior. Yeah, and then you got this Obamacare headline that was discussed in the package. This is going to be something. My guess is that we're going to have a whole lot less change to this health insurance program than some people think.
Kelly, yeah, sure. Kelly Conway was on the news this morning and said, of course, we're not going to kick anyone off health insurance that has it now. That's one of the most important aspects of Obamacare. There are things to improve.
There are 20 million more folks on health insurance. There's a precondition clause that no one wants to see, pre-existing conditions. And then there's the 25, 26-year-old stay on the family policy, which drives the cost of this thing. So it'll be really interesting to see where the mechanisms are to solve this expense issue, which is really the only thing that Obamacare is problematic for. It's all about costs.
That's right.
Right? It's not about access. I mean, more people have access. Now it just costs more.
And of course, our dear state of Rhode Island has done very well with this, relatively speaking. Right?
Well, yeah.
Relatively speaking.
To a point with our own health exchange. Yeah. Interesting. All right, I want to talk about Russia when we come back, because there's a whole, I don't even know how to explain it. By the way, with this brand new year, a lot of us are making some resolutions to simplify our lives. Don't mind if I cheat, because this is a whole bunch of information that you need to know about. There are a whole array of mobile banking features that Navigant Credit Union has brought to the table for 2017. And with the mobile banking app, you can pay your bills, deposit checks, transfer money, set limits on your spending, use Apple or Samsung Pay in stores, or even send and receive cash through texts. It's all quick, it's easy, it's just a few clicks, and you can learn more about it at navigantcu.org. Federally insured, of course, by the NCUA, new partner on Dan York's State of Mind. We'll be right back. Of course, the entire intelligence community is telling us that Russia did it. But the president-elect says, hey, I know a lot about this stuff. Headline here. Really? Here's the latest from CBS.
CBS News has learned that over the last few days, U.S. officials have begun investigating new and potentially successful cyber intrusions, raising concerns that the Russian hacks might have been more extensive than originally thought. And government analysts are still investigating if Russian hackers successfully breached Vermont's electrical grid. Malicious code found on a utility company laptop has been traced to what they call Grizzly Step, a widespread cyber espionage operation linked to Russia.
Well, I just want them to be sure, because it's a pretty serious charge.
But President-elect Donald Trump continues to express doubt about Russia's involvement.
I know a lot about hacking, and hacking is a very hard thing to prove, so it could be somebody else. And I also know things that other people don't know, and so they cannot be sure of the situation.
Mr. Trump promised new information on Tuesday or Wednesday, but Sean Spicer, the Trump transition spokesman, seemed to walk that back.
Well, it's not a question of necessarily revealing. Remember, the president-elect is privy to a lot of classified information, intelligence reports. He gets briefed by his national security team on a daily basis.
But it is unclear where Mr. Trump or his national security team is getting their intelligence reports. All U.S. intelligence agencies are in agreement that the Russian government, with the blessing of Vladimir Putin, orchestrated aggressive cyber attacks prior to and during the U.S. election.
He knows a lot about hacking. I don't know.
No, that reassures me.
That's the stuff that makes you worry. Makes me worry.
If that were not attached to his disregard for what all of the intelligence agencies are telling us, I would say, he has license to say ridiculous things once in a while. But this is not just ridiculous. This is positively dangerous for, I would say, global security, not just American security.
Because?
Because he is undermining U.S. credibility in the world by saying that somehow our president in power now and all of our intelligence agencies don't know what they're talking about. So the next time we come up, even under his leadership, to say, we have these facts, people can go back and say, well, President Trump, didn't you say that those facts were wrong back when you disagreed with them? So we disagree with them too.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to care about that process going forward. He lives in the now. To your point last segment, he very well may, and if you listen to what he was saying there in the clip where he was caught on the fly, he very well may, after the Obama administration doubles, triples, and quadruples down on this information and lays it out so that it's almost, that it is practically or absolutely undeniable that we have Russian intervention, and he takes office, he's very apt to say, hey, you know, now that I really have read it, or now that I have this new information,
right,
and now that I've actually done even some more investigation on hacking, you know, because I know a lot about hacking, I do think that they played around with it, and we'll all say, oh, okay.
So
because it'll end up that way.
I expect he will do that.
Yeah,
and he will.
I think everyone's got a built-in threshold of pain for his right.
Right. So I expect he will do that, but in the process, what has happened is that somehow Putin has been made to look like the rational guy and the U.S. extreme. Why? Because we kick out diplomats, we kick out spies, and they don't do anything. They hold back. And of course, President-elect Trump praises President Putin for doing this. So the bromance that began, you know, some time ago actually is now growing. And of course, that can create possibilities. But what my concern is that even as every president, President Bush the second tried it, President Obama tried it, every president tries to begin by redefining the relationship with Russia, beginning on a positive note. And this, Trump is no different. However, one of the things that is different is that we are making our allies insecure. We are making our allies worry. That NATO, for instance, is less of a priority than the bromance with Putin.
I get to the point where I run out of questions on this, because I don't know. I just think it's fascinating to watch the day-to-day discourse. I just hope that everybody understands what's at stake, and I don't know that anybody can do anything about it. We elected him.
I think two things can happen that would improve everything dramatically.
Okay.
The first is that some people, including our former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, are advocating that we should have a bipartisan committee investigate publicly and transparently what this Russian hack was.
Right.
Point number one, that brings Congress together, and it takes us away from this, intense,
He's got to acquiesce to that.
Right. Then the second thing.
They'll do it with or without his acquiescence.
They're going to do it, and so he should embrace it.
Right.
Rather than
and then use it to say, you know what, okay, I'm better informed, I give.
Exactly.
Right.
And the second thing that's really important, and the reason why this Russian hack is more than a Russian hack, it didn't decide the election, it shifted public discourse more critically toward Hillary Clinton and less critically toward Trump. It did affect it in that way, but it didn't change votes. We have to be clear on that. But what makes this such a point of concern is that we really don't know the extent of President-elect Trump's financial implication in Russia, and with whom he's tied.
Hold that thought, because that's where we want to go when we come back. We'll talk about that. Stay with us.
Even those who are sympathetic to President Obama on most issues are saying that part of the reason he did this today was to, quote, box in President-elect Trump.
All right, so that's from last week in Kellyanne Conway, spokesperson for Trump, obviously, talking about the president, sending diplomats, packing.
Right.
And then, of course, Donald Trump was able to say, hey, listen, I knew Putin was smart. The cooler heads prevail here. All of this rigmarole over the hacking, I think you're right. I think you're going to have a situation where Congress will step in and try to have the signature on this topic. But the bigger question is investment in foreign countries,
right?
And whether or not Donald Trump's position with all of his investments starts to reflect guys like Putin who really run the country for his own profit.
Right.
I mean, I think we're well built to seize the moment and defend against that. But that's what disclosure is all about. And so far, not so good, right?
That's right. So, I mean, this is a point that goes beyond partisanship. I think both, obviously, Trump's opponents want him to disclose and divest, but even his supporters ought to want to do this. Why? Because we want to make sure, we want to have confidence that there's not some kind of financial interest that's moving his decision making. And we can do that if we know what all of his investments are, what all of those contacts are. For example, there's this organization called Bayrock, and a recent piece in the American Interest by a guy named James Henry, I think it is, argued that this Bayrock is sort of directly connected to the Russian mob. Now, I don't want to believe this, but I want to be sure that this is not the case. And so the only way that Trump is going to be able to reassure the whole public, because he's the president of all Americans, he's not just the president of Republicans who were not never Trumpers, right? He's the president of all Americans. He has to reassure all Americans that there is nothing in his financial portfolio that allows Putin or even the next, he has ties to Indonesia, and there's a political figure who's going to be running for office who is his partner, right? So we have to make sure that somehow his financial ties are not shading his decisions. I'm not doubting his integrity, but I just don't want the American public to have a reason to doubt it. And that's going to be solved only by his releasing at least his taxes.
Which he won't do unless he really steps in it somewhere and the tide turns on him. I think this guy has a chance to be one of the most successful presidents in the history of the country, and also impeached in 8 weeks. I mean, I'm not sure which. Right?
That's a good right. And in fact, I mean, this is his weakest. I mean, there's so many reasons why progressives and the left and people of color will object to him, right? And
right.
We acknowledge that. However, everyone will object to somebody who's obviously using his public office for personal gain. That is called corruption. There's a guy named Norm Eisen who's really good on this, and he wrote a piece recently. He's been appearing, and he's actually trying to help Trump see that his interest is in actually becoming transparent, not becoming what he was.
The Trump factor has been unprecedented, but the American public does one thing. It goes like this on an issue. And if corruption or worry about, investment conflict ends up being a top concern,
right.
It happens like that, doesn't it? Good to see you.
Nice
Appreciate
to see
it. Professor Michael Kennedy. When we come back, we'll tell you what's up for tomorrow. Tomorrow night, State Representative Patricia Morgan, who leads the Republicans, will be in here. I hope we're not going to talk about things like making Christmas easier for everybody at the legislature. Big doings, car taxes, road works, all that kind of thing, pressing for the taxpayers. So we'll be on that tomorrow.